Hi everyone, and welcome to AI. My name is Nadine Vlasian. I am AI's program manager. I'm happy to welcome all of you to today's talk. We have a very special talk today in our Book on Display series. The title is Writing on the Edge of the Abyss, Aram Andonian and the Spoliation of the Armenian Library of Paris. So our guest today is Boris Achemian, the director of the AGBU Nubar Library, a very special person to have, and it's an honor and pleasure for us. So let me just very briefly go through some housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. So this event is being recorded. Please mute yourselves unless you are speaking, and switch off your cameras if you don't want to be seen in the recording. If you have questions, please leave those in the chat, and if we have time at the end of the talk, we will go through some of them, depending on how much time we have left. And yeah, I guess that's it for the housekeeping. So it's a pleasure to be introducing our speaker today. It's Boris Achemian. So Boris Achemian is a historian and director of the AGBU Nubar Library in Paris. He defended his PhD in 2011 at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and Università degli Studi di Napoli in Italy. He's the co-founder and co-editor of the academic journal Études Arméniennes Contemporaines and editorial board member of 20 et 20 ans, Revue d'Histoire. He has recently defended his habilitation to do research at École Normale Supérieure in Paris on the following topic: archives, exile in politics, Aram Andonian, and the Armenian Library of Paris. So I'm terribly sorry for my French, by the way. I think we're ready to start. And Boris?
I'm ready. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a small explanation. It was not a habilitation to do research, because no one is habilitated or not habilitated to do research. It was a kind of habilitation to be an advisor for PhD candidates. So it's a different degree, which is after the doctorate, and it's I think interesting that this habilitation was submitted and defended on such a topic. The topic was the history of the Armenian Library of Paris. So I was asked to present a book, since it is a book on display, but since I don't like, I never do what is required. So instead of choosing a book, I choose to present two notebooks, an unpublished manuscript, which was written in Armenian about the spoliation of the Nubar Library in 1941. So the event I'm going to speak about this evening, the spoliation of this library, is closely linked to my current activity of research as a historian who is in charge of one of the richest resource centers of the Armenian diaspora, namely the AGBU Nubar Library. Before getting to the heart of the matter, I must give some background information about the history of this institution in order to explain how important it was to its founders and why the perspective of its spoliation by the Germans during World War II appeared so critical to them. I must also tell you about its first librarian, Aram Andonian, who had been the initial designer of the library in the smallest detail since its inception, and who had become the soul of the library and was in charge of it until his death in late December 1951. So the Armenian Library of Paris was founded after a decision made in 1927 by the Central Board of the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the AGBU, whose headquarters was located in the French capital since 1921. More precisely, the AGBU office was located in a beautiful Art Deco building designed by the Armenian architect Levon Nafilian and built in 1922 by a group of Armenian entrepreneurs, so in Paris, not far from the Trocadero, for those who know. At the time, the heirs of Vicen Holas, a wealthy Catholic Armenian from Constantinople, who owned a particularly rich collection of books, so a private collection of books, his collection. The heirs of Vicen Holas, Uremen, offered them as a donation to the AGBU in Paris, on condition that the organization, the AGBU, would make them, these books, available to the largest audience through the creation of an Armenian public library in Paris. The AGBU hesitated during several months before accepting this donation because the potential running costs of such a library seemed too expensive. Finally, the president of the AGBU, Boros Nubar, bought a flat in the same building of Square Alboni, where the headquarters of the AGBU was located, and offered this new flat as a gift to the AGBU in order to create this Armenian library. He also gave his personal collection of Armenian books for this purpose. Thus, the decision to create a library was made. It was called at the time the Armenian National Library of Paris, Parisi Haigagan Askain Madenataran, before it was renamed as Bibliothèque Nubar, Nubar Library, or Nubarian Madenataran, after the death of Boros Nubar in 1930. Right after the initial donations from the heirs of Vicen Holas and from Boros Nubar himself, I mean the donations of books, several other important donations were offered to the National Library as it was called at the time, donations by wealthy collectors and amateurs, book bibliophiles, we say in French, cuirassiers, such as the heirs of Mikhail Pasha Portucalian and various personalities close to the AGBU, such as Alexander Harens, for example, and Calouste Gulbenkian himself, and many others. Strikingly, the library was founded at the very moment when the dreams of an Armenian national home in the Middle East had disappeared, as if the new institution was to serve as a kind of symbolic territory for the nation in exile. The purpose of creating this new institution was to create the possibilities of a national revival after the genocide and the destruction of most of the Armenian cultural heritage in the Ottoman Empire. With regard to this context, it is significant that the first librarian designated by Boros Nubar himself to be in charge of the library was Aram Andonian, a former journalist and a well-known author from Constantinople who had miraculously survived to the genocide after having been arrested on 24 April 1915 and subsequently deported to the Syrian desert. During the second half of his life, after World War I, Andonian moved to Paris, worked for the Armenian National Delegation, also led by Boros Nubar at the time. Then he worked for the AGBU as an employee, and he devoted his energy to develop the Armenian Library. Even though Andonian, Aram Andonian, is mostly known by the public as the man who published several Ottoman telegrams incriminating the leaders of the Committee for Union and Progress in the extermination of the Armenians in 1919-1920, it is important to know what Andonian had been before the genocide and what he did after the genocide. Actually, the life of the library was so intimately linked to Aram Andonian that writing the history of this institution equates almost to write a biography of Andonian. I say almost because writing the biography of Andonian is something which is perhaps unreachable because of the lack of sources. Between 1927-28, date of the creation of the library, and 1951, date of the death of Aram Andonian, the Armenian Library of Paris became his main preoccupation. That is to say, the major oeuvre of the second half of his life. Although he remained a modest employee of the AGBU and most of his work remained unknown to the public, Andonian was the one who collected, copied, and classified so many books, archives, manuscripts, newspapers and periodicals, autograph documents and photographs that constituted the core of the Nubar Library's collection. During the late 1920s and 1930s, thanks to the encouragements of the AGBU Central Board and the tireless activity of the librarian Aram Andonian, the library received a very important number of books and archive donations from individuals as well as from institutions. The nerve centers of these donations were Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria, where the AGBU was extremely well established for historical reasons, and even more Constantinople, Istanbul, from where many Armenians and Armenian institutions were inclined to send their books and archives abroad in order to escape the harsh restrictions imposed by the Kemalist regime to any visible expression of Armenian cultural identity. Thus, in less than a decade, the Nubar Library had rapidly grown as one of the 4 major Armenian libraries in the diaspora, together with the militarist libraries of Venice, Venedig, and Vienna, and the important collections of the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem. In this period, the political situation in the USSR was too unstable, and cultural institutions of Soviet Armenia were not strong enough, not yet, to attract such donations. Thus, those books most often printed in Constantinople, Alexandria, Aleppo, Beirut, Bucharest, Boston, Paris, tended to remain in the diaspora. The very nature of the project of creating a so-called National Armenian Library in Paris, albeit seeming odd nowadays, reflected at the time the vivid debate about the possibility of a concurring existence of a distant Hellenic in Soviet Armenia and the numerous Armenian colonies, the Karut, in the diaspora. The founders of the AGBU and many intellectuals living in the diaspora, such as Arshak Jobanyan, considered that creating such institutions in the colonies was not contradictory to the national project. On the contrary, they considered that the donations made by Boros Nubar to the Armenian Library in Paris, and at the same time, which is also significant, to the Maison des Étudiants Arméniens, the house of Armenian students at the Cité Internationale Universitaire de Paris, were important realizations for the future of an Armenian nation. So developing the colonies in the diaspora was not in opposition to developing the possibility of a future for the nation. This rapid development was jeopardized, I'm not sure about the pronunciation of this word, during World War II, when the Germans who occupied Paris attempted to confiscate the books of the Armenian Library. Here we are. This is an event that very few people know and which might seem difficult to understand. Why should the Nazis care of an Armenian library in Paris? I'm always asked. And I asked myself the first time I heard about this history, of course. However, this confiscation of the Armenian library was not isolated. It must be considered in the broader context of German generalized spoliations in Europe during World War II. A lot has been said, of course, about the spoliations of artworks by the Nazis. The general public is less aware, however, that this policy of spoliation was also directed towards books and archives, as well as music partitions, for instance, music instruments and house furniture. These spoliations have been well analyzed and described since the early 2000s in a number of academic publications, especially the pioneering works of the historian Patricia Kennedy Grimstead and in France by several historians such as Sophie Queret, Martine Poulain, and many others. In Paris, the spoliations of libraries by the Germans targeted mainly the collections belonging to foreign and/or Jewish institutions. The main plundered libraries in Paris were the Turgenev Library, a Russian library, the Petliura Library, a Ukrainian library, the Polish Library, the Czech Library, the Jewish Library of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and many other institutional and private Jewish collections of books, some of them famous and huge, such as the books of the Rothschild family and the like. Also, many libraries belonging to Russian or East European socialists living in exile in Paris were robbed by the Germans. The lootings of the Armenian Library, the looting of the Armenian Library is a particular case in this series of plundered libraries for reasons that I'm going to explain, or to try to explain. While in most cases, the lootings of these Jewish and foreign libraries were implemented in a very short time and in the absence of witnesses, the spoliation of the Armenian Library lasted an unusually long period of over 3 months, thanks to the existence of a diary written by Aram Andonian himself. We have a unique opportunity to read about these events in greater detail. Andonian's diary is a manuscript entitled Nubarian Madenatarani Talane, Im Oracrutunus. The looting of the Nubarian Library, my diary. It is written on 2 notebooks, totalizing 251 written pages. The text in Armenian was hitherto unpublished and had never been studied nor translated. I am going to follow the thread of this diary and to quote some excerpts in order to introduce you to this strange story of the spoliation of the National Armenian Library of Paris. So this testimony is a rare testimony on library spoliations for reasons that I have explained, that the fact that most of the time we have no testimony of what happened in all these Jewish and Slav libraries spoliated in Paris and elsewhere in Europe. On 10 January 1941, Andonian starts to write his diary right after the first visit of a German officer to the Armenian Library. Another visit by 2 German officers this time was repeated a few days later. These visits raised the suspicion of Andonian, well aware of the recent spoliations of Slavic and Jewish libraries in Paris that had occurred in August and September 1940, so about 5 months earlier. Consequently, he begins to put aside some valuable books in order to preserve them from a potential German spoliation. Thus, he asks some Armenian neighbors living in the same building of Square Alboni to host secretly some of these precious books in their flat. Among others, he asks the Armenian painter and engraver Edgar Shahin, who refuses, arguing that it would be very dangerous to hide these books in his flat by fear of the Germans. Andonian explains in his diary that he started to transfer many books to the cave by night. The cave, the Negur. I don't know if the word is cave in English. By night, bringing on his back heavy loads of about 50 books. He comments on the difficulty of this hidden labor. And I'm quoting him. When I returned to the library, I looked like a man straight out of a sack of flour. My clothes were completely covered in dust. I had to take off my clothes to clean them. My cleaning was even more difficult on that cold day in the library, which was completely without heating. It was like an icebox. He used the word sarnaran. I immediately went to bed in the hope of warming up, but the cold had gone right through me. And he describes like this with a lot of details what happens every night, every day during the time of during the 3 months of his diary. Andonian explains how, in the following days, he secured the archives of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, the personal papers of former Patriarch Marakia Ormanian, and other irreplaceable autograph documents. He also narrates how he saved the magnificent manuscript Haismavurk, a lectionary of the lives and acts of the saints, made in Tokat in 1673 and given to the library by Kalus Gulbenkian himself. He explained how he hid the book under his couch when the library was requisitioned by the Germans. On 10 February 1941, the Germans announced to the AGBU the transfer of the library to Berlin. The spoliation starts the day after, on 11 February, as narrated by Andonian. I'm quoting him again. This morning, at 7 o'clock, before daylight, I was startled awake by the loud banging on the door. In the darkness, they had not seen the doorbell. When I opened the door, 4 Germans came in, one in military uniform, the others in civilian clothes. There was also a soldier with a rifle on his shoulder who had stopped at the top of the stairs. He was standing guard and did not enter. One of the Germans spoke in French and told me word for word, "Today, all the books in the library will be requisitions for transfer to Berlin." He also added that they had no part in this requisition, that the order had come from the Berlin police. He used the word Polizei, and that they were obliged to carry it out urgently, as they had been ordered. Then, taking out of his pocket a typewritten paper in German with various stamps on it, he handed it to me and said, "Here is the written order." A moment later, the door opened and more than French porters, he means removers, entered one after the other, each carrying 1 or 2 empty boxes. After piling them up in the corridors and lounges, they went downstairs and returned with more boxes. There was a great commotion coming up the street to us, but it was not possible to see what was going on through the window. There was no doubt that the street was full of military transport trucks. The coming and going of the porters was repeated a few times, while the corridors and lounges of the library were almost all filled with empty boxes until it became completely impossible to move around. Then the movers spread out in the first 2 rooms and, bringing down the books, or more correctly, throwing them on the floor, began to fill the boxes. One of them, with a bottle of ink and a brush in his hand, wrote the letters S-O-R on the lid of each full box while numbering them. End quote. At the time of the requisition, Andonian lived for several years in the library. He had his room in the library. That's why he's awakened by the Germans banging on the door. The looting by the Germans appeared to him both as an attack on a national asset, a precious national asset, given the character of the library, and as a personal attack. Some of the books of the library were his books. He had given them to the library. One of the most interesting aspects of Andonian's diary is that it shows us the spoliation at an eye level, on a human scale. The text is particularly rich in material details. The author also describes his personal impressions, sometimes with almost humorous anecdotes, like, for instance, Andonian explains how the day after the beginning of the requisition, he had an Armenian coffee with a German officer. Quote, "Oriental coffee was completely unknown to him, and at the first sip, he burnt his mouth. But he enjoyed it very much, and I had to teach him how to prepare it. I gave him a small packet of coffee, and he wrote down some details about the method of preparation." End quote. On 12 February, the AGBU submitted a request to the German authorities asking for the library not to be requisitioned. In support of this request, the AGBU produced a report written during the night by Andonian in French, which explained the importance of this library for the Armenians. And I'm quoting now this report written in haste by Andonian. In a country where one of the most important agglomerations of the Armenian people dispersed throughout the world as a result of the tragic events of the other war is located, the existence of an institution such as the Nubar Library is not only a blessing for the Armenians of France, whose number exceeds 70,000 souls, but above all, it is one of the most effective means of preserving the feeling of their original nationality. We hope that these few explanations will have been enough to demonstrate that the Nubar Library has not only been a repository of documents and volumes without moral effect, but one of the living sanctuaries of Armenian influence and spirituality. End quote. On 14 February, the librarian waits feverishly behind his door, behind the door of the library, for the removal men, the French removal men, to arrive to remove the 168 boxes filled in the previous days. But the hours pass and he sees nothing coming. Quote, 8 o'clock, the doorbell is still silent. 9 o'clock, then 10, then 11, 12, nobody comes. I begin to think that they have had an impediment and that they will show up in the afternoon. I went to the door twice to leave, to go to lunch, but my hand did not go as far as to open the door. After the second attempt, I decided to stay in the library and walked around the flat, end quote. 3 days earlier, on 11 February, when 168 boxes of books have just been brutally filled by the removers, Andonian describes a landscape of desolation in the library. Quote, the 6 rooms were filled with boxes full of books and stacked on top of each other. A perfect scene of looting that I found absolutely dismal as my eyes roamed the rows of shelves. For nearly 15 years, these shelves had been filled with colorful bindings and familiar books, which had caused me much fatigue and suffering, but also pleasure and in greater measure. Now, in their skeletal emptiness, these shelves had taken on the appearance of an ossuary, and the boxes piled up in a pyramid shape gave the impression that coffins lay in the center of the room. In each of the 6 rooms, the spectacle was the same. I gradually moved from one to the other. There was still a lot of stuff beyond that. Packets of newspapers, files of correspondence, notebooks, books, pictures had been left in this or that corner like rubbish. On many of the high shelves, books had been left, and no one had thought to take them down. Other books had fallen under the tables, and these too had not been taken. End quote. Wandering through the library with Andonian, his friend, Dr. Varam Torkomian, cannot help but compare the devastated library to the ruination of the medieval city of Ani, a symbol of the collective misfortune of the Armenians. So he compared Ani with the state of the library after the coming of the Germans. Through Andonian's eyes, thanks to his diary, we can see how different was the fate of the Armenian library compared to Slav and Jewish libraries and private collections. The Jewish libraries were sent to Frankfurt am Main, where the Nazis had created a research institute on the Jewish question. This institute had been created under the auspices of the Hochschule, the high school, of the Nazi party, whose role was the ideological training of the future executive managers, leaders of the party. Alfred Rosenberg had a major role in the creation of this so-called Jewish Institute. He had also organized and directed the looting of Jewish art, books, and properties in Europe, through the creation of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg Operation Staff or Task Force, to a specialized organization dedicated to the looting of Jewish and other people's properties. The books robbed by the Germans in the Slav libraries were sent specifically to the Ostbücherei, Library of Oriental Studies in Berlin. Andonian refers several times to the spoliation of these libraries in his diary. For instance, on 19 February, he writes, "Meeting with a Russian acquaintance of mine, the man was envious of us, the Armenians, because he had heard that not all the books in the Nubar Library will be taken away. Of the 72,000 volumes of our ancient library," he said, "not even one notebook could be saved," he told me. "You are more fortunate." He also described the circumstances of the requisition of the Polish library, of which he had been an eyewitness and which were unknown to me. When the Germans came to the Polish library, a speech had been prepared on the spot. They immediately ordered the speaker and the audience to leave without wasting time. Then they also emptied the library of its employees and left after sealing the building. The next day, the Russian told me, they set up boxes in the street on both sides of the door, and a few days later, there was not a sheet of paper left in the library. He was curious as to how we had managed to become the subject of a more lax protocol. I told him that the reason was completely unknown to me. End quote. So contrary to the spoliation of the Armenian library, all the lootings of Slav and Jewish libraries in Paris by the Germans were implemented in a very short time, as I said during my introduction, generally in a couple of days, between August and, for the last ones, October 1940. As I said, there was no witnesses left of these lootings, and most of the time, no independent reports. Therefore, the historians who wrote about these spoliations mostly rely on German bureaucratic sources. Another major difference is that, contrary to, if you like, there is no Jewish or Slav Andonian who has written a diary or a testimony about these spoliations. Another major difference is that, contrary to these Slav and Jewish libraries, whose spoliation was exhaustive, 100% of the books were taken, the Armenian library was submitted only to a selective looting. The reason is that after the request submitted by the AGBU on 12 February 1941, the German authorities decided to send a specialist from the University of Berlin to Paris in order to select the books which would be transferred to Berlin. This specialist was an Armenian, Professor Ardashes Apeghian. He arrived in Paris on 18 March 1941. On the eve of World War II, you must know that the Nubar Library held a collection of approximately 20,000 printed books, several hundreds of manuscripts, and important series of Armenian newspapers and periodicals. Finally, the number of items looted in 1941 amounted to, let me say it in English, 1,331 printed books, of which 917 in Armenian language and 414 in European languages, as well as 481 periodicals, bound or in bundles, and 33 ancient manuscripts. Another important aspect of the diary written by Aram Andonian is that it shows the internal tensions existing inside the Armenian community. When the upcoming transfer of the Armenian Library to Berlin was announced by the German authorities in Paris on 11 February 1941, a delegation of the AGBU was led by Dr. Paul Kololian. He was in charge of the council of the AGBU, since the central board of the AGBU had been transferred in 1940 after the French defeat, and the German victory had been transferred to New York. and the main decisions were taken in New York, but there was still an executive committee in Paris, and the director of this executive committee was Dr. Boros Kololian. So he led the delegation of the EGBU to the Hotel Commodore, which was the headquarters of the Reichsleiter Rosenberg operation staff in Paris. A number of other Armenian organizations were represented. Delegates of the Armenian Apostolic Church of Paris, presidents of the two offices of Armenian refugees, Arshak Chobanian and Alexander Khatisyan, preeminent members of the Union of Armenian Physicians, Doctors, Varan Torkomian, the president of the Union of Armenian Youth in Paris, Haider Tovma, representative of the Armenian colony of Paris, Father Balabanian, representative of the Catholic Armenian community in Paris. This shows the interest of several organizations in the defense of the Nubar Library, which is not only the library of the EGBU, although it was the EGBU Nubar Library, but it was considered as a national asset. So it was something very important to be defended, not only for a single organization, but for all the community. Andonian explains that the German officers of the headquarters of the Reichsleiter Rosenberg operation staff were well aware of Armenian internal political divisions and rivalries, and in several occasions that they mentioned their appreciation of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the ARF, or Tashnak Tsutyun. Andonian, himself an old opponent to the Tashnak Tsutyun, insists several times in his diary on the ambiguous behavior towards the Germans of Alexander Khatisyan, former prime minister of the Armenian Republic in 1918-1920, and a leading member of the Tashnak Tsutyun. He, Andonian, bitterly criticized the opportunist Germanophilia in some Armenian circles. Quote, "Here, as in Berlin, the German victory had simply driven many of our people mad. For some, this sudden Germanophilia was a mere matter of gain. For others, who believed that the situation thus created was destined to last, or who wanted it to last forever, Germanophilia was a real political inclination, and they believed that by placing the nation's fate in Germany's hands, they could satisfy their resentments and hatreds." End quote. In a thinly veiled criticism of the Tashnak party, Andonian also writes, quote, "Of course, Mr. Khatisyan and many of his party leaders and members, as well as non-Tashnak Armenians, are under the spell, the charm of the Germans. Perhaps that is why they not only believe in, but also wish for Germany's final victory." End quote. So Andonian sees an Armenian hand behind the looting. He doesn't think that the Germans are really motivated by the perspective of looting the Armenian library. And he considers that it is rather an intra-Armenian affair. Thus, he notes incredulously on 21st March, quote, "Chobanian, Arshak Chobanian, came early to the library with astonishing news. The Germans were planning to found an Armenian library in Berlin, which they would call Nubarian, while the books requisitioned from us would be kept there. I thought he was joking, but he was serious. If only this could be the result of his credulity. It was simply the second mention of the famous so-called Armenian Institute which the German government, more precisely Goebbels, who supervised such actions under his heavy and implacable paw, was supposedly going to establish in the triumphal precincts of Greater Berlin to the glory of the Armenian nation. But it is no secret to us that these men," he means the Nazis, "are showing clear contempt at this time for our nation. Even the Aryan origin of the Armenians, which seemed to be a source of pride, vanity, but above all of security for our people, is regarded as doubtful by them. He means, again, the Nazis. And this worries many people who fear that the Armenians, if not directly subjected to persecution like the Jews, may be subject to strict restrictions, end quote. For Andonian, it was a looting orchestrated by the ARF, the Taschnakzutun, with German support, to the detriment of, to the expenses of the AGBU. It was therefore an Armenian looting rather than a German spoliation. It is necessary here to give some explanations of the role attributed by Andonian in his diary to Professor Ardashes Apeghian. Ardashes Apeghian was a well-known Armenologist. So it is the professor I have mentioned earlier in my presentation who came from Berlin to Paris in order to select the book at the request of the German government. Ardashes Apeghian was a well-known Armenologist. He had published many works on Armenian folklore, popular tales, literature, and language. Prior to that, he had served in the Armenian parliament from 1918 to 1920 with the Taschnakzutun. He was a member of the party. In 1921, after the Sovietization of Armenia, he moved to Germany, where he took up a teaching post in the Department of Oriental Languages, Seminar für Orientalische Sprachen, at the University of Berlin. By this time, he had established numerous contacts with German Orientalists and had become a figure in the small Armenian colony in Germany. After 1933, Apeghian worked to demonstrate the Aryan origin of Armenians, notably in a collective work entitled Armenirtum Arirtum, published in Potsdam by the Deutsch-Armenische Gesellschaft, the German Armenian Society, in 1934, and re-edited during the war. Apeghian was also the vice president of this society, which was chaired by the German Protestant theologian Paul Rohrbach. Together with Rohrbach, Apeghian co-edited the publication of the periodical Hayastan, Armenia, in German from 1937 to 1944. During World War II, Apeghian was the chairman of the Armenian National Council, which included anti-Soviet Armenian nationalists, such as Garegin Nejde and Rastamat Kanayan, better known by the diminutive Dro. This council aimed at seizing power in Armenia after the German victory over the USSR. It is in this context that Apeghian also published the Armenian monthly Azad Hayastan, Free Armenia, which was aimed at the soldiers of the Armenian Legion who fought alongside the Nazis against the USSR. In March 1941, Apeghian was entrusted by the Germans with the task of selecting the books of the Armenian Library to be transferred to Berlin. Aram Andonian and Arshak Chobanian were commissioned by the AGBU to assist Apeghian in this tedious task. In reality, the three men had a very tense relationship for 2 or 3 weeks, punctuated by clashes, insults, and vehement disputes over this or that book, which was considered rare and therefore valuable. Chobanian and Andonian tried to resist Apeghian's claims, sometimes using stratagems, while Apeghian argued that he was in a strong position to choose the books he wanted to choose. These are at least the terms of Andonian's account. It would be futile to seek an objective account of the facts, for Andonian makes no secret of his fundamental hostility to the Tashnak party, his personal enmity for Apeghian, and the fact that he considers the Tashnaks in this affair to be traitors who have passed into the service of the German. This aspect of Andonian's account may be related to the importance of the themes of betrayal and conspiracy in his literary as well as his documentary works. Despite its lack of objectivity, Andonian's diary provides an original and irreplaceable testimony to these little-known events. However, this manuscript raises a number of questions that I will not solve. It is difficult to know when and under what exact circumstances the manuscript was written. Indeed, Andonian diaries contains many obvious interpolations. Its division into two parts, part 1 called Period of the German Requisition and part 2, Period of the Armenian Requisition, clearly shows that Andonian knew the end of the story in advance, and in particular what he considered to be a betrayal by certain Armenian circles, namely the Tashnak party. In sum, this manuscript lacks a colophon, which would allow us to clarify the circumstances of his writing. But it is quite clear that the manuscript is not a first draft and has been revised, possibly several years after the spoliation, and most probably towards the end of the war, or even in its immediate aftermath. It is clear from this reading that Andonian's text is a narrative rather than a diary, and this narrative supports a thesis, that of an Armenian betrayal, a conspiracy. It is therefore an indictment that has the appearance, that takes the appearance of a diary. It is a combat text, not a writing intended to remain personal, like a diary should be. This reminds us of Andonian's past as a polemicist when he was a journalist in Constantinople before the genocide, and even in Paris and Berlin in the years following the Great War and at the time of the trial of Soromon Teriayan, which he attended in 1921 in Berlin. The questions raised by the writing of this pseudo-diary lead us more broadly to re-examine Andonian's relationship to writing and witnessing. This question has been already studied in relation to his writings on the genocide, but it is raised again here in relation to what appears, with the possible destruction of the library, to be a second catastrophe for him. The question makes even more sense since Andonian restarted to gather testimonies on the genocide in the immediate post-World War II period, in the wake of the Nuremberg trial. Thus, this pseudo-diary should definitely be reread in the post-war context. That is to say, in a period when recovery commissions were set up by the Allied governments to return to their former owners, at least to those who were still alive, the property that had been stolen from them by the Germans. The AGBU used Andonian's reports and passages from his manuscript, his diary, or so-called diary, to make its case to these recovery commissions and later to the Federal Republic of Germany. At the same time, in 1947-1948, there was an acrimonious press controversy between Andonian and AGBU on the one hand, in the Ramgavar and communist Armenian press, and Ardashes Apeghian on the other, in the Tashnak press. A controversy between them over the library spoliation case. Andonian used, during this controversy, his diary extensively to support his accusations against Apeghian. Thus, his manuscript became more than a diary, it became a piece of evidence. Andonian died in 1951. The AGBU tried but before my concluding remarks, I would like to show you a few pictures, because initially I had not planned to show pictures, but after discussion this morning with my personal coach, I was advised that this kind of image can bring flavor to the dry speech of a very classical historian. So I would like to share my screen briefly with you, if I can do it. Yes, partager l'écran. And to show you some pictures. Do you see my screen? Do you see the picture?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, this is only a picture inside. Sorry for the quality of the picture, they are mine. It's a picture inside the Nubar Library today. just to give you flavor. Another one. This is the reading room of the Nubar Library. This is the flat, the building built by the Armenians and by the Armenian architect Levon Nafilian in 1922 in Square Albany, Paris, and who hosts the AGBU headquarters and the Nubar Library on the first floor. Of course, you recognize Boris Nubar. Here, a meeting of the AGBU in the late 1930s inside the Nubar Library. You can recognize Zare Nubar here, one of the sons of Boris Nubar, Levon Gümüşgerdan here, an important administrator of the AGBU. You have Vahan Malaysian, another very important actor of the AGBU of the time, and Chobanyan, here Archak Chobanyan on the first rank. This is inside the library. Here, a portrait of Aram Andonian. I've talked a lot about him, and instead of sending a portrait of me and to put it on the advertisement for this lecture, we should have posted a portrait of Andonian, I think. And so it's a portrait in 1919. So he's not like this during the spoliation of the library. He's much older during the spoliation of the library. He's about 60-year-old almost. And this is the famous notebook, or one of the two notebooks. So you can see Nubarian Madena Tarani Talane, Imora Krutunas, Arachin Masev, first part. And if you look into the, of course, you cannot read because it's small on your screen, probably, but you can see here the title. It is written Arachin Mas, Sherchan Kermanagan Kravman. So first part, period of the German requisition or occupation or spoliation. And it is very interesting that in the same notebook, after 50 or 60 pages, a number of pages, he starts another section, a second section called Yegrot Mas, Sherchan Hagagan Kravman. So a title saying, okay, now I will talk about the period of the Armenian occupation. So now he will talk about the traitors. He will talk about the conspiracy. He will talk about the fact that in his view, it is not a German spoliation of the Armenian library, but it is an Armenian spoliation of the Armenian library for political internal reasons. So it shows clearly that actually he knows what he considers the end of the story. He knows it before writing it in his diary. He's not only writing day to day. So there are probably things written day to day in this diary, but the diary has been obviously revised, and you can see also on the page that there is no erasure. There is no corrections. It's very clean. So it's not a first draft, if you like. It's not a first draft, and obviously it is complicated. The chronology of the writing of the diary is a bit complicated and difficult to specify. Here is the cover of the second notebook. So Nubarian Madena Tarani Talane, Imora Krotunas, Yegrot Mase. Yes, here is the end of the last page of the diary, the so-called diary. So it is dated Paris, Tasnierek, April, Hazarinariu Karasun Meg, so 13 April 1941 in Paris. It is signed, and he explains that this is the end of the story. He gives his conclusions over what he thinks to be a big conspiracy, and that's it. He signs, as he always do. So I think it is the last one I wanted to show you. Oh yeah. So I will stop to share my screen and just say a few words now. Yes. Yeah. So Andonian died in 1951. The AGBU tried still to recover the books, the missing books, until the mid-1960s. All these attempts were in vain. They were not successful. However, in 1976, so 25 years after Andonian's death, the director of the State Library of Minsk, Belarus, announced to the director of the Matenadaran in the Soviet Republic of Armenia that 27 Armenian manuscripts and 25 prints belonging to the Armenian Library in Paris had been found in Minsk. The director of the Matenadaran, Levon Khachigian, wrote shortly afterwards to Ardashes Apeghian, one of Aram Andonian's successors at the Nubar Library, to tell him the good news. Quote, "I have no doubt that you and our friends of Armenian culture in France will welcome this news with joy. After long wanderings, freed from their torment, these precious fragments have found their final stage under the roof of the fatherland." End quote. So ironically, these books, which were written or printed in Constantinople or in the Ottoman Empire, who had belonged to an Armenian National Library in Paris, had finally made their way to what was presented as their natural home in Soviet Armenia. The tormented destiny of these books reflects the situation of many exiles and repatriates within a 20th century transnational Armenian space, of which the Armenian Library of Paris was the product. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Boris, for this insightful and informative talk. I think we'll all learn so much. Let's maybe move on to questions from audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand or maybe just leave it in the chat, possibly. Yeah, Vaskin, please.
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Boris, thank you. This was absolutely brilliant. I'm really grateful to your personal coach who asked you to share some images, because they really did give us a flavor of what you were talking about. So thank you to him too, or her. Now, I have a sort of double question. You talking about the text, Andonian's text reading as a narrative, so rather than as a diary. So my question, I hope this will come through sort of quite clearly, but was obviously this isn't a first draft; it's a second draft. It could have been a third draft, but clearly it would have been based on his original diaries. So do these exist? Have these survived? Are there copies? Are they in the Nubarian library? And would it be possible to sort of compare them to this final narrative that you actually presented, his Orakultun, as he calls it? And my second question would be Ardashes Apeghian. Now, you said that he was an editor of a newspaper in German during this particular period. Does he make any references to the books that were basically selected and shipped off to Germany during this period? Are there any references to it in his work? Because he could be another source that you could sort of go to, perhaps. So thank you.
Okay, I believe personally that there was a diary which served as a basis for this final text. Even though I think that the text has been revised, but it is not possible, I think, to reach such a degree of precision in details just by inventing a story or not having written every day what was happening. After the fact that a diary is revised is not something exceptional. It happens in many cases for various reasons. But the fact is that I never found any track of a first draft of the diary in the library, and I looked well. So unfortunately, there is no comparison possible. Concerning your second question, so I told you there was a controversy between Apeghian and Andonian and the AGBU, but actually Andonian was giving all the arguments to the AGBU. This controversy was in the press, so you can read the press and read the perception or the presentation of the facts by Apeghian, and you will understand his version of the facts which exist. Also, he wrote several letters. Some of them are in Yerevan, some of them are with us at the Nubar Library, to some intellectuals, to like Arshak Chobanian, to convince him to support his version of the facts, and to say that Andonian was inventing the story, this kind of things. So you can read, for example, Harach, the French Armenian newspaper, which was a Tashnak press, and there is a long series of articles by Apeghian in response to Andonian's argument. And after, it is very interesting also that the fact that Ardashes Apeghian is he has been somewhat forgotten in the Soviet Union because of his links with the Germans before and during the war. So there was some kind of attempts of rehabilitation of Apeghian after the independence of Armenia. And you can look a bit on if you look a bit on the internet, you will find some articles about him, also some videos about him, and they are all apologetic. And they describe him as a patriot who saved many Armenian lives. The fact that he defended the idea that Armenians were Aryan people in front of the Nazis is taken as something very positive, that he, in this way, he managed to save some Armenian people. And also when the Nubar Library story is mentioned, it's always to say that thanks to Baron Apeghian, Professor Apeghian, the Nubar Library was saved. So it is the total opposite of the version of Andonian. But of course, I could give you references, but the Andonian diary is much more descriptive and massive than any argumentation on Apeghian's side, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Mark Mamigonian.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, Boris. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation on a subject I've always wanted to know more about. Has a complete list of the removed items ever been published? Is it in the public domain so that if there are still items in circulation, they might be watched out for? And secondly, were any of Andonian's genocide and post-genocide era documents that either he collected pertaining to the genocide itself or the survivor testimonies that he gathered among the materials that were removed at that time?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, fortunately, there was not such documents for two reasons. First reason is that he says several times in the diaries that after the first visit of the Germans to the library, he managed to hide every archived documents. He does not mention these documents, the testimonies about the genocide that he collected. He mentioned the document pertaining to the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul or the national delegation, for instance. And he says that he hid them and that the Germans were not aware of their existence. So Apeghian was not aware either of their existence. He didn't try to select them. In the meantime, I don't think that Apeghian would have been very interested by testimonies about the genocide, because at the time, only Andonian was interested in this kind of testimonies that he was collecting personally. These testimonies had no value, no specific value, even for the heads of the AGBU. I think they were not aware of their importance. And also, of course, by historians. At the time, historians were not studying this kind of testimonies. So it's a pre-testimony era. And Andonian was in advance in a way. He was not the only one. There were cases also elsewhere in the Armenian world. elsewhere or in other diasporas, like in the Jewish world also. Yeah, it had no historiographical status at the time, and so it was not attracting the appetite of looters. But your first question was about the list. We have lists. The lists are very clear, so they were produced, copied. They were not published, as far as I know, but we have several lists, all copies of the same list based on Andonian's list. And the initial list was a list made and signed by Andonian, Apeghian, and Chobanian. So it was signed by the three of them. So we can easily see what was recovered after the war. Very few of the books were recovered. Only these few books that I mentioned at the end of my presentation that were in Minsk, they were in Minsk and they were sent to the Martin-Adaran. But, and it will be another story to find the missing books, about more than 1,000 books. But during the defense of my habilitation in May 2022, one of the members of the jury, she's Sophie Curé, she's a specialist in Soviet archives, and especially the question of spoliations of archives during World War II. She told me that she knew someone in Minsk who knew about our books. So there was a we met with this person, and he sent me pictures of the books that are still in Minsk. So it means that, and some books were sent from Minsk to Yerevan in 1976, but in the meantime, some of the books are still in Minsk. We don't know how many, but for sure, I have seen the ex libris of the books. These are the books of the Nubar Library. And some of them were mentioned even in the diary of Andonian that I have translated and that I want to publish.
Thank you.
Yes, Richard.
Thank you.
Boris,
And
thank you.
yeah, there was a question from
Sorry.
Tuan Virginia.
Yes.
So yeah, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I mean, it's really an eye-opener, and I had read the book that was prepared by Professor Kuyungjian of Canada on Aram Andonian. The way you are presenting what he has done, I mean, Professor Kuyungjian thought that he was an honest man. The way you are presenting him today sounds to me like there is some dishonesty in the way he signs his and dates his memoirs, or whatever you want, his agenda. So I just, as a corollary to what Professor Mamikonian just asked you about the genocide-related papers, so what is your belief about, you know, the famous Talat telegram and the Andonian papers, about their veracity and what the accusations are about them being fake?
Thank you. So no, it's an important question, even though straight from the beginning, when I started this research, I said, and even during the defense of my work, I said I am not interested by the question of the authenticity of the Talat Pasha's telegram. For me, this question is a question of the past. But I was sure that when I was reading the diary and asking questions about the writing of the diary, someone will come. I'm not talking about you, but some ill-intended people will come and, I mean, deniers, and will say, okay, so you said that his diary has been revised, so it is the same for the telegrams of Talat Pasha. There is always this risk. Although I don't think, personally, that Andonian was dishonest, but I have to try to keep a balance and to say that it is his version, because otherwise I will be accused by some apologists of defenders of Apeghian of having destroyed Apeghian on the sole basis of Andonian's argument. But I think that Andonian was, yes, honest in the way he worked, and but he was a polemicist. So he used he used writings to fight, and that's what he did when he was an activist, trying to prove the reality of the genocide. The fact that he was an activist, that he was using the arms of an activist, doesn't mean that there was no genocide, doesn't mean that he was lying, but he was clever. You know, these telegrams, he says that he bought them, so that he bribed someone to buy the telegrams. That's what he said. So he was not having barriers saying, oh, okay, I should not do that because otherwise I will be accused of being dishonest. He had a goal, he had an aim of proving something, the genocide in 1919, or later on the spoliation of the library, which is of course another topic. And in each time we can see that he used his skill as a writer and as a polemicist in order to prove his right. I'm not sure I'm clear. I'm sorry, it's because of my English, as you understood.
Tu peux le dire en français si tu veux.
Je peux le dire en français, but I'm not sure that everyone will understand here. So even if my English is bad, I think some of you can understand.
Merci.
Merci à vous.
Thank you so much. We had a question from Richard Anushan. So, Richard.
Thanks, Narne. Thank you very much, Boris. My apologies. I didn't know how to put up the little yellow hand that asks a question there. So now I know. But thank you for this very insightful discussion on a very interesting aspect of Armenian history that I don't think is well known and still very much alive, though, via the Nubar Library. Boris, the books. Can you share with us just generally, or maybe even specific examples, what books were deemed to be important enough to take and card off? Was it history, literature, philosophy, ancient Armenia, or the maps? So what was deemed to be so important that they needed to be carted off and brought to Berlin or somewhere else? And that's what I want to know.
Yes. When each time we think to the Germans robbing some books in an Armenian library or any library, to pick them up and transfer them to Berlin, we think to Indiana Jones, you know, and they want to take the Graal or something very precious. But it was not like this, apparently. It's a bit odd, it's a bit bizarre. And this is also one of the reasons why Andonian believed that the Germans were not interested that much by the Armenian books after they changed their mind. First, they wanted to take everything. After they changed their minds, they sent an Armenian to select the book. Finally, this Armenian, Apeghian, according to Andonian, selects mainly the books that are interesting for him. And Apeghian was still writing. He was preparing an anthology of Armenian literature to be published in German. And Andonian says, oh, he's picking this book and this one because it will serve him for his anthology. So these are mainly books about literature, but sometimes in Armenian, sometimes not, sometimes booked by German geographers, for example. But there is no, it's not really consistent. When you look at the list, it appears that the books were taken, okay, they were selected, but in a way which is a bit, not in a very serious and methodical way. So it's according to the tastes, perhaps, of Apeghian, if we follow Andonian's version. There is no exceptionally valuable book, except the fact that some of these books were rare and difficult to find in Europe. So, for example, I've seen that in Minsk, they still have, I know it because I received the photograph, they still have the first edition of the Haigazian Parkirk, which is, bon, it's a famous book, but there are other editions of this book, but of course the first edition is something valuable. And at the time of in the 1930s, the AGBU was not rich enough to buy books for the library, so everything was by donations. So if books were stolen from the library, it means for Andonian that he will not have them anymore. So, and but again, there is no secret book revealing special things like telegrams, for example, because we all like this kind of stories, but no, nothing like this.
So there was no overall theme or anything. It was quite random and haphazard and really driven by an individual, one individual.
Yeah, it looks like it was rather random. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. That's interesting. Thank you. Thanks, Nari.
It's a bit disappointing. Myself, I would prefer something more. But no.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Felix Corley.
Merci, thank you. In the later Soviet period, Armenian archivists and the Matanadaran and other places, they had a policy of trying to seize as many Armenian-related manuscripts, books, museum pieces from around the Soviet Union and also from abroad and bring them to Soviet Armenia. So I was interested, the books that were taken and manuscripts from Minsk to Yerevan, did they offer them back to the Nubar Library or did they decide to keep them? And what was the response of the Nubar Library to this? And my second question is the Soviets, with all the confiscated materials, artworks and libraries and so on that they took from Europe, they were often distributed around the Soviet Union. Some paintings in, Yerevan's picture gallery came from Germany. Some of them went to, galleries in Siberia or whatever. It is very possible that some of the materials ended in Minsk, but others went to other places. Have people looked for them in Moscow or Kiev or other locations? Thank you. Merci.
Merci à vous. Yes, concerning your first question, no, the Matenadaran, the Matenadaran didn't propose to the Madenataran to send back the book to Paris. They said all the books came back to their natural homeland, to their fatherland. How wonderful! Are you happy? And the director of the library in Paris, Ardashes Apeghian, no relation with the famous Kardashian, he said, "Oh, yes, we are very happy." So that's the end of the story. But I think that today, if it was happening today, it will not go. It will not. We will not write only, okay, we are happy, keep them. We will try to find another solution. But at the time, this is the mentality of the time also, that the Soviet Armenia, must attract all the resources because it is the core of the Armenian nation. Still, there is this ideology, and still there is the debate of the divide or competing existence of how do you say it? Not competing, but completing existence of the diaspora and of Armenia. So, but it's an old debate, and it was already a vivid debate in the 1920s, and still the debate is very strong. And concerning your second question, yes, most probably the books, some of the books were dispersed. I don't think they are all in Minsk, although I have no clue to say yes or no. But some kind of inquiries were made, investigations were made for the books, for example, of the Russian Library of Paris, the Turgenev Library, of the Petliura, the Ukrainian Library. Some research were made to find out the books. Sometimes unsuccessfully. For example, the Turgenev Library, after research, they never found the books. I think they found one book after years and years of research. They found one book belonging to them before the war, and finally they had to rebuild an entire collection of books. And but this kind of work, I'm not intending to. This kind of research, I'm not intending to do it now, because it's a research for a team, a research team, not for a single historian based in Paris, I think. But it's, yeah. So I will not go to Siberia to look after the books.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat, was from Jennifer Manukian. What a gripping story, Boris. In addition to your study, do you plan to publish a full translation of Andonian's diary?
Yeah, I'm planning to publish a full translation, and I would like to publish a bilingual book with the original text in Armenian as well, preceded by an introduction with notes. Yeah, could be a nice book.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. It's quite late in Paris, so yeah, any more questions?
Can I ask another one, if I may?
Sure.
I was just wondering whether the former priest, the Armenian priest in London, Nazarian, Abel Nazarian, who moved to France in the 1920s, do you recall, did he play any part in the activities of the library or any of the public institutions there, as far as you know? Abel Nazarian. He was born Abel Abrahamian.
I could not say. I could not tell you. I'm not familiar with this name. So I mean, through the archive that I've read, I don't think so. But it has to be checked. But
okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Boris, for this amazing, informative talk. It was an absolute pleasure. Everyone's like clapping their hands. We had a lot of thank you notes in the chat too. So
the cave is the cellar. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there were some comments. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for making the time and delivering this amazing talk. And let me also thank our audience for being here. We are going to have an in-person launch of a digital exhibition on 1st December. So next Thursday, that's an in-person event. So whoever can make it, you're all welcome. We will be talking about our NLHF grant and what we did during those 2.5 years. So it would be great to see many of you there. And yeah, just stay tuned and follow us everywhere. Give us your likes on social media and subscribe to our newsletters. Thank you so much, Boris, once again. And hope to see everyone very soon. Thank you for being with us. Thanks.